Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets face their toughest test of the season during a 3-game road trip and come out on the other side still looking like a fairly good basketball team. I break down what that means and answer questions about the direction the team could potentially be heading after the theme music. What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. And before we get into this episode, if you do not already, go subscribe to Believe in Nets on all streaming platforms. Hit up Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. More importantly, go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Please, please, please like, comment, subscribe, anything you can do to interact with the video and the content I create is much appreciated. But recording this at about 10 a.m. on Tuesday, coming off another Brooklyn Nets win last night, 107-105 over the battered New Orleans Pelicans. And that caps off a 3-game road trip where the Nets really faced their toughest test of the season, had a back-to-back against the Boston Celtics and the Cleveland Cavaliers on Friday and Saturday before this New Orleans matchup. And the Nets were 4-4 when they entered this 3-game road trip and a difficult upcoming 6-game stretch. And I said on my last episode, there were a lot of questions about the Nets tank. Is this team too good? Could this be heading in a direction that potentially isn't the most productive or beneficial for them landing a top 10 pick? And I said, look, guys, we're heading into a 3-game road trip, a 6-game stretch that's going to be really difficult. This stuff may sort itself out, and we may see a lot more clarity and answers about this team potentially going closer to that tanking direction just by a product of the schedule being more difficult. And, the Nets lost 2 of 3 on the road, but I still leave with more, concerns about the team's, say, tankability, for lack of a better term, than I had before, because they dropped a back-to-back in Boston and Cleveland, but we're very close to winning both of those games. And we're winning for the majority of both of those games against 2 of the best teams in the league on a back-to-back against a team that was 10-0 in Cleveland. Really looked like the better team for about 3.5 quarters during that one. And then they got out an ugly win last night in New Orleans. And the questions are just going to continue to persist about this team. Are they too good? Do they have too much veteran talent? Is Jordi Fernandez too good of a coach? Does Sean Marks need to make moves to set this back in a taking direction? Or could they potentially be this frisky playoff team or play-in team that nobody really envisioned entering the season? So I'm going to answer those questions first on this episode before getting into some of the specifics with some players, Cam Thomas, Noah Clowney, some of the things we saw during this 3-game road trip. And then I'm going to answer some questions that I received from fans on Twitter and via email to close the episode out. But talking about this Nets team, they're 5-6 through 11 games. They're 15th in offense, they're 17th in defense, 15th in net rating. And when you look at the question of, is this team too good right now? If you leave this team as currently constructed, is it too good? And is it a team that's just going to play itself out of having those top 3 to top 5 odds that really put you in strong contention for that number 1 pick? And I think it's fair to say right now that is a very legitimate concern, which a lot of people did not want to give credence to or, admit entering the season, because, I do think this team is playing above expectations, but there was still, I've talked about this several times throughout the beginning of the season, there's still a lot of depth, talent, competent basketball players on this Nets team. You look at the 1 through 9, 1 through 10, however many guys are playing in their rotation on a nightly basis, there aren't really too many glaring weak links, which is what you see. You look at a lot of teams that are tanking in the NBA nowadays. You see, especially towards the end of the season, which we still might see with the Nets, but you see guys who are, G Leaguers, guys who don't really have any future in the NBA, guys who are really just filling space for teams. The Nets don't have any of those guys. The Nets have guys that are either have been, good rotation players on decent NBA teams, or guys who are on the track to being that in the future. So this blend of veterans and youth is really playing high-level basketball in this system under first-time NBA head coach Jordi Fernandez. And the reason I say that, I think there are some legitimate concerns for this team as currently constructed being too good is, it's still a small sample size, but we're 11 games in, and this team is playing a style of basketball that feels fairly sustainable in, terms of their ability to be competitive and win games on a somewhat regular basis. Now, you look at the way that the Nets are playing, a lot of it is oriented around winning the math game, winning the 3-point battle, which is the way that Nets have played for, past regimes have tried to play this way, and a lot of NBA teams in general just try to play this way. But you look at the numbers, the Nets are 7th in the NBA in 3-pointers attempted. They're attempting 40.4 per game. And they're shooting okay. They're not shooting great. They're shooting 36%. That's 15th best percentage in the NBA. So right in the middle of the pack, they're making 14.5 threes per game. But you look at that volume, and they don't have to shoot that well. But based on the volume and the number of threes they're getting up, they're converting, they're making a lot per game, obviously. So then you look at the opponent and the way that they're defending the 3-point line, they're allowing the 4th fewest 3-point attempts in the league. That's 33.3 per game. And, opponents aren't shooting well. They're at 34%, and that's the 8th worst percentage. So if you're looking for a place where there can be some positive regression and potentially hurt the Nets, that would be the area. I think opponents are going to start to shoot a little bit better from 3 than 34%. But the Nets are guarding the 3-point line well, and they're not allowing a high volume of threes. So, you look at that, they're winning the math game, as I said. They're attempting 7 more threes per game than opponents, and they're making 3 more threes per game than opponents. So that math game and where that bears out, if you're looking at teams who are winning the math game in terms of 3-point volume the most in the NBA, the Nets are in like the top 5 in that category this season. So that's the way that they're playing. As I said, I think opponents will start to shoot better, but the Nets aren't shooting great themselves. They're shooting average. So I think that, and they have a lot of good shooters on their team. Like, this isn't a team that doesn't have 3-point shooters. They have veterans who can shoot. They have young guys who can shoot. They have guards who can shoot off the catch or off the dribble. And they're trying to play fast. They're trying to play with a lot of pace. And this is a way of playing that Jordi Fernandez is clearly committing to. And these players have shown success and ability to thrive in early this season. So having said that, that brings you to the question of, is the tank actually in danger? And I think the main question that everybody should be asking themselves, at this point, or the question that naturally arises by this early play is there actually a point where the Nets are playing well enough for long enough where Sean Marks and Joe Tsai decide to lean into the winning instead of stripping pieces down and going for that top pick? Is there a point where they say, look, we like what we have here, and we actually want to try to be, as I said, that frisky play-in or playoff team? Is there a point where they kind of have a shift in mindset and look to go in that direction? And, I talked about this the other day on SiriusXM NBA radio, and I was asked this question by Brian Scalabrine, and I said, I really don't think so. Like, I don't think that this is a situation where the Nets are going to lose sight of the goal, because Sean Marks and Joe Tsai know the goal here. When Sean Marks made the trade, sending Mikal Bridges to the Knicks in the offseason, which really sent the Nets on this new direction towards this rebuild, and in coordinates with that move, got his first-round picks this year and next year back from the Houston Rockets, he knew the goal. He said, the strength of the 2025 and 2026 draft classes, played a strong role in this decision. We like the players in those class. We like the assets we have to try to build around potential draft picks, all that type deal. So it sounded like at the time, and I don't think, while I think this early play has been encouraging, particularly from the standpoint of Jordi Fernandez and looking like one of the better coaches in the league through the first 11 games of the season here, I think that's encouraging, but I don't think it's a situation where Sean Marks and Joe Tsai are going to look at these two paths, which the one path could be on the high end, could be, being a first round exit. Like, that's the high end of that outcome. The low end is, that's the high end of that outcome. The other outcome is getting a top 10 pick. So you're looking, or a top 5 picks. You're looking at those two different areas where you're talking about making the playoffs potentially, which I don't really think this team can, but trying to go in that direction and trying to play and be fun and exciting, versus landing a top 3 pick. I don't think there's really a question of which one of those paths set the team up best long-term. And I think Sean Marks and Joe Tsai know that. So then, having answered that question, the next question becomes, is there, will this team, who is playing pretty high level basketball right now, or much higher level than we expected, will they do irreversible damage if they continue to wait until the trade deadline to make these moves? If they keep the guys like Dennis Schroeder and Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith around, who are playing very good basketball to start the year. I mean, Cam Johnson is having a really good year to start, which he's been healthy. He looks much more spry. He's shooting the ball at a very high level. He's even shown a lot more flashes of self-creation than anything we saw last season while he was battling injury. So that'll help him from a trade values, standpoint, I've obviously been over what Dennis Schroeder has done. He's been awesome also. So those guys are increasing their trade value, but right now they are hurting the team in terms of racking up wins that maybe the team didn't expect early in the season, and is creating some separation in the early going from them and from the teams who are expected to have the worst records in the league. So at what point does Sean Marks step in and decide to make a change? At what point does he try to course correct and set this on the direction that the organization was aiming for entering the season? And I've said it that I think December 15th is the date that fans should have circled on their calendar, because that is the date when free agents who signed this past offseason can be traded by their new teams. It's either December 15th or January 15th. It depends on when certain players sign. But that's the date where trade season really starts. And trade season doesn't really start until like the end of January, February, leading up to the trade deadline. But, that December 15th date is when things kind of start to get going. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't make moves before then. Teams have made moves before then. It happens. If there's an urgency by two sides to get a deal done, there's nothing that prevents them from doing that at this juncture. So Sean Marks could make moves right now to trade off some of these veterans. Now, he could also wait, obviously. And that waiting, the reward of waiting is potentially having more suitors, having more people who are looking to make those kinds of moves, having more teams that have a sense of where they are, whether they're underperforming and need to get better, whether they're overperforming and are trying to get themselves over the hump. The buyers and the sellers kind of start to bear themselves out. So at that point down the line, there's potential to get more value and a greater return. But the question becomes, is getting that more value and a greater return worth the damage that you might do to your lottery odds in the meantime if your team continues to play at this level and continues to win games that potentially you didn't think they would early in the season or entering the season? So I said December 15th, 13 games on the schedule until then. That might increase around the 15th because the in-season tournament, they start to fill games in at that point. During that, there's like an open week in the middle of the season. But you look at the 13 games, it's Boston, the Knicks twice, Charlotte, Philadelphia, Sacramento, Golden State, Phoenix, Orlando twice, Chicago, Indiana, Milwaukee. Now, if you're looking at that and trying to cipher out which games will the Nets win and which games will they lose, it's more difficult than you would have expected entering the season, because the Nets are competing in games that you really didn't expect them to. So it's tough to say they have no shot in any game on any given night. But if you're looking at the games, if I'm out of those 13 games, if I'm counting out games that I really think that they have a good shot to win, I'm going to say Charlotte, Chicago are really the two that jump off the screen with the way Milwaukee's playing right now. Maybe Milwaukee, but out of those 13 games, I think it would be surprising if the Nets won more than 3 or 4 games out of that stretch. So at that point, let's say that they win 4 out of their 13, so they're 4-9. You're getting to 9-15, say, at that point where that December 15th date's hit, right around that mark, which, that's being a little generous. If the Nets win 4 games out of that stretch, which maybe it's not generous based on how they're playing. It's kind of tough to predict out what this team is or how they're going to compete on any given night. But 9-15, that still puts you a little bit above where you want to be. And then Sean Marks, has the ability to make those moves to set this on the right direction and course correct. So, those are really the questions right now. It's kind of getting to this point where I think a lot of fans are eager to see Sean Marks make some of these moves. And I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities that he could make moves sooner, than expected, sooner than that trade period when that really starts. But trades are unusual during that period. And I do think that it might be more towards the trade deadline. So we'll see. We'll see how well this Nets team continues to play. We'll see if this play is sustainable, as I think it is. And we'll see, how much damage maybe they do to their lottery odds in the meantime. So last night was an interesting game. They were down and then they came back. They end up winning. New Orleans really played abysmal down the stretch. But I'm thinking, down the stretch of these games, I'm just wondering, how are Nets fans rooting for this? I put up a poll after I think they beat the Bucks earlier in the year. Just did you want the Nets to win while you were watching down the stretch of this game? Yes or no? And I think it was pretty even. So I'm curious down the stretch of these games, because the last 3 games, the Nets had a very real chance to win down the stretch. And, I think against Boston and Cleveland, who were 2 of the best teams in the league, when you were 12-plus point underdogs, I think a lot of fans probably wanted them to win those games just because it's a cool story for this supposed tanking team that everybody expected to be the worst in the league to beat teams like that. So I could see that. But then last night, when they're playing a decimated New Orleans team who really isn't playing good basketball down the stretch, I think that one might be a little, like we could do without this win. So I'm interested, fans, comment, reply, tell me how you're feeling. I'll try to respond to it as best as I can on the pod. But that's sort of the big picture stuff. Now looking at some of what we saw during these games, I want to talk about a few players. The first one, Cam Thomas, because Cam Thomas last night in this New Orleans game hit his most clutch shot of the season. The Nets were down 2 with like 35 seconds remaining. He dribbles left. He steps back. He drains a 3 to put them ahead.
Hands to Thomas. Fernandez trying to call a timeout. Thomas fires. Nylon! Cam Thomas drains it to put the Nets in front.
And then they get a stop and they end up winning the game. And Jordi Fernandez was actually trying to call timeout on the play, which I'm sure everybody saw who was watching the game. And Cam Thomas obviously didn't realize, and he gets into his shot and goes for the 2-for-1, he says, and splashes it, and they end up winning. And the refs just don't see Jordi Fernandez a few steps onto the court calling for the timeout. So that's got lucky in that case, or unlucky, depending on whatever you're rooting for. But I think this game was really telling for Cam Thomas. And Cam, I think he's had a good start to the season. Like, the efficiency hasn't been where you would have hoped. That's still down. But he's made some really high leverage shots, and he's shown a lot of resiliency to be able to bounce back from bad starts, which is really something that's encouraging for a young player. A guy who's only 23 years old and is in his 4th year in the league. And he didn't start off bad in this New Orleans game. It was just he wasn't as involved as he normally is. He had only taken 6 shots through the first 3 quarters of the game, but then he steps in and he shoots 3 of 4 in the 4th when the Nets needed him most. And I think that he didn't have poor body language throughout the game. He wasn't too involved like other guys were handling the ball and creating. Ben Simmons, a guy we're going to talk about later, earlier in this game. And Cam, on some games in the past where maybe with that type of game script, his body language might not have been the best, or he might not have looked the most engaged. I thought that Cam's body language looked good. I thought he continued to play good defense as he had. I think his defense has taken a noticeable step forward early this season. And then in the 4th quarter, when the Nets needed him most, he hadn't been that involved. He hadn't been taking that many shots. You don't think he was probably in the same kind of rhythm maybe that he normally is. As I said, he shoots 3 of 4 in the final period. He makes that clutch 3, and he really propels this team to a Nets victory. So if you're looking at a young player and you're looking at mental resolve and growth and maturity, I think Cam really showed all of those things during this performance. And just talking about the 4th quarter this season, Cam has been clutch this season, man. Like, Cam is a guy who I don't think anybody has ever doubted their confidence. But when you're looking for traits in an NBA player, now confidence, you can be confident to a fault almost sometimes, which I think Cam, that's been a question about him in the past. But if you're just looking at confidence, you're looking at, guts, you're looking at all those things, you're looking at a guy who loves the spotlight. Like, Cam is unequivocally all of those things. And he's really shown it this season in terms to be not just a clutch scorer and all these things, but really just like a productive and efficient guy in high leverage moments. You're looking at the 4th quarter. Cam's 3rd in the NBA in 4th quarter scoring this season. He's averaging 9 points per game on 56, 50, 87 shooting splits in 4th quarters. And then you get, even deeper into the actual clutch situations, which is final 5 minutes of games within 5 points. Cam's 4th in the NBA in clutch scoring. He's got 31 points in the clutch, and that's behind only Nikola Jokic, DeMar DeRozan, and Kevin Durant. And as I said, he's been efficient in those moments. He's shooting 49% from the field. He's 4 of 8 from 3 in the clutch. Hit the biggest one of the season last night, and 4 of 8 from 3. That's the NBA's 2nd best percentage among 20 players with over 5 clutch 3-point attempts this season. So Cam Thomas, I think there's still room for growth, like the playmaking. We talked about it. I talked about it with Jordi Fernandez. I think I went over it on my last pod, but I asked him after, I think it was the bad Pistons loss where Cam was inefficient and wasn't really getting others involved. And Jordi said he wanted to see a lot more of that. He wanted to see him impact the game in other ways outside of scoring, whether it's as a cutter, as a spot-up shooter, as a facilitator. I think over these last few games, Cam had 6 assists in like 2 of his last 4 games. So he's playmaking a little bit outside of that when he hasn't had the ball in his hands and hasn't been in positions to either be a playmaker or that primary shot creator. His body language has still looked good. He's still been involved. So I think you're seeing growth in a lot of areas. And if you're looking for the biggest positive out of all of this, I think it's that growth and emotional maturity. And then also just the ability to be a efficient and productive clutch, fourth quarter scorer. That's something that's, you don't see that from a lot of NBA guys, let alone, guards who are 6'3" and 23 years old. So good stuff from Cam Thomas. And I think last night was a really encouraging performance from a lot of angles. And if we're staying on the youth train, another young guy who was really, turned in probably his best offensive performance of his career was Noah Clowney, who was 5 of 10 from 3 last night, becoming the youngest player in Nets franchise history to make 5 threes in a game. He's 20 years and 120 days old. So really just a baby. And he makes 5 threes, passes Rodions Kurucs for the youngest player in Nets franchise history to do that. There's a Nets name you probably haven't heard in a while, Rodions, who was encouraging and then kind of fell off the wagon there. But talking about Noah, offensively, we all knew the defensive traits that attracted the Nets to him in the draft process. And that was obviously his perimeter defense, his versatility, his rim protection, all things that he flashed during his rookie season last year and continues to flash now. The question was offensively, could he be enough of a floor spacing threat to play alongside traditional centers, to be a power forward, to be able to attack off the dribble and attack closeouts in certain situations? Those were the questions of, will he be able to develop these offensive tools to really let his defensive versatility shine potentially alongside a guy like Nick Claxton, with him playing power forward and Claxton at center. And if you're looking at least the willingness and the confidence to shoot threes this year has definitely been there for Noah. He's attempting 8.8 threes per 36 minutes this season. That is nearly triple what he did in the brief moments that he played as a rookie. And that ranks 16th among NBA forwards. And I got that from NBA.com. And that group, the forwards, that's including like wings who, aren't the same position that Noah plays. So he'd really be higher on that list if we're looking at only power forwards and guys who play like him. So I said, 16th amongst forwards, potentially higher, and then 5th among NBA centers, his number of 8.8 threes per 36 minutes. So that willingness is, I think, something that's really encouraging and important, and something that I've talked about a few times early this season. And I think a lot of that goes back to, obviously, Noah, his mindset. He has never been a guy who's been afraid to shoot. He's, quiet and has a little bit different of a personality, but the confidence has never been questioned. I don't think, if you've been watching him his rookie season and this season, that there's any questioning that. And I think a lot of that just comes from his mental makeup. And then some of it, he credited Jordi Fernandez for instilling confidence in him after last night's win, because Noah's only shooting 33.3% from 3. He's jacking them up at a high rate. They look good. Like I'll say, a lot of them, the stroke looks good. They're often on line. They're often back rim or in and out misses. So they look good there. But sometimes when you're a young guy and you see that percentage at only 33% and you're shooting really high volume, you might want to see that percentage go up. You might shy away from taking some of those looks. And Noah has not done that at all. And, he credited Jordi Fernandez and said that, I think that he said he thinks Jordi has done a good job of instilling confidence in players, being direct and straightforward with what he wants, but also, having fun with the game and really allowing his players to be confident in the things that he wants them to do. And then you're looking at Jordi. I mean, with Noah not shooting the percentage that he is, but still taking a lot, Jordi has said that's what we want. And he's really embracing a process over results type of mentality. And this was just the quote that Jordi had last night when he was asked if he was surprised, given Noah's low 3-point percentage, to see him be able to make 5 in a game. He said, no, because I see him shoot every day and I know he's a good shooter. When I get mad at the guys is when they stop shooting. And Noah, the one thing he's done consistently is just continue to let it fly. That's how it works. You cannot control if it's going to go in. You can control if you take the shot. And he kept taking good shot after good shot after good shot, and 5 of 10 from 3. That's what we want to see. So that's the quote from Jordi Fernandez. And I think a good example of what I talked about earlier with Jordi's philosophy and the 3-point heavy style of, high 3-point volume and defending the 3-point line the other way, winning that math battle. I think Noah Clowney is, it's a good microcosm of that philosophy. And it shows a little bit of Jordy's coaching approach with the way that Noah talks about it, and also the quote that you got directly there from Jordy. So good stuff there. Last player that I want to talk about is Ben Simmons before I get into some questions quickly, because Ben was removed from the starting lineup for this 3-game road trip with Nick Claxton coming back into the starting lineup. Ben came off the bench for the first time this season against the Celtics on Friday. He sat out the Cleveland game because he's not playing back-to-backs anymore. And then he came off the bench this past game, even with Dorian Finney-Smith out due to an ankle sprain. Zaire Williams got the starting nod, and Ben Simmons still came off the bench. So I think it's clear at this point that Jordy Fernandez doesn't believe in Ben and Nick Claxton as a pairing. It's something that I've asked him about several times during training camp leading into the beginning of the season until, this past week. And, Jordy said he's willing to experiment, and he said all the right things that you would expect a coach to say, but actions speak louder than words. And I think it's pretty evident that he does not believe in that, pairing, which is not surprising given what I just said about the Nets' 3-point approach, them winning the math game, playing 2 near 7-foot non-shooters is not exactly conducive to that type of play style. So he'll play them like for a few minutes here and there, but not for extended stretches. And I think those two have played like 11 or 12 minutes together on the season through 11 games. So that speaks for itself. But we're talking about what Ben did last night off the bench. He looked great in the first half of this game. He had 10 assists and 0 turnovers in the first half, 4 points on 2 of 3 shooting. And that was a really encouraging half of basketball. He played pretty well against Boston too. I think he, outperformed Nick Claxton in that game. But even with him outperforming Nick Claxton, the Nets lost his minutes against the Celtics reserves. So the play style had not up to that point really been conducive to success with Ben Simmons on the floor. They were just losing Ben's minutes up to those points through those first 10 games. Then last night, they actually won his minutes. This first half, he was a +8. So it was his most productive in terms of individual production, actually aligning with team success. This first half was his best. And that's not surprising when you have 10 assists and 0 turnovers in a half of basketball. He was really dominating the ball in this first half. He was doing all of these good things in terms of pushing in transition, finding shooters in the half court, finding the cutters, whether from the baseline or, guys relocating for threes and things along those lines. So great first half from Ben. But then you talk about the second half, and this is where, the problems start to rear their heads, and the shortcomings and limitations of Ben's play style really start to show, because 10 assists and 0 turnovers in the first half, 4 points on 2 of 3 shooting. Second half, 2 assists and 3 turnovers with 2 points on 1 of 2 shooting. And there are really 2 main issues that stick out with Ben if you're just trying to boil it down to like the big picture stuff. The first of which is his pass shoot balance is skewed about as far as it could possibly go in one direction. And when teams start to figure that out as games progress, now I think teams have just done a bad job about it this season. Like I tweeted during the game, like, I don't know how many times Ben's going to drive and a strong side defender is going to help off of a strong side wing or corner shooter. When you know that Ben only wants to pass the ball, like if I were a coach, that would drive me absolutely nuts, because you know that there's a guy who is not looking to score, looking at the basket. He only wants to pass. So if he's driving there and a guy's in position, unless there's like a wide open lane, why are you helping off of shooters? Like that just makes no sense to me. But as I said, pass shoot balance is just so far in the pass direction that when teams start to figure it out and they start inviting him to shoot instead of pass, he refuses to do it. And that's what really happened in this second half of last night's win. Ben looked great passing the ball in the first half. And then in the second half, the Pelicans start, trying to take that away a little bit and are giving him some opportunities to try to attack his shot. And he only takes 2 shots. And there were 2 fast breaks in the second half of this game. And this is something that Ben has done like 5, 6, 7 times now already on the season, where he has just open lanes and they're inviting him to go to the basket and he's looking everywhere but the basket, and it ends up being a turnover.
Brandon lost the handle. Another turnover. Simmons. And he left it for Brandon Ingram. And a good box out by Ben Simmons and an opportunity for Brooklyn to take the lead. He lost the handle. It'll be picked up by Brandon Boston.
That's the issue in terms of the pass shoot balance of where his head's at, the aggressiveness. It just isn't there. It hasn't been there since he joined the Nets, and it doesn't look like it's going to get there. And I mean, you're looking at one number. Like Ben has not been to the free throw line in 7 of his 8 games this season. He's taken 4 free throws on the year. So 7 of 8 games, he has not made a trip to the line. And that's not because he's not playing. Like, he's playing a good amount. He's playing like 25 minutes a game or something along those lines. So to play, 9 games, 25 minutes a game, and have beat 4 free throws, 2 trips to the line, like, that is about as damning a stat as you can imagine for a player who's 6'10" and 240 pounds, and really early in his career was a guy who really played physically and did all those things. So I said, first issue, 2 biggest issues. First one being that pass shoot balance. And the second one is Ben just shrinking as these games progress. And, I touched on a little bit of why that is earlier with teams, taking certain things away. But Ben's just scared to shoot. Like, I've made that clear, and I think anybody who watches understands that. But he's deathly scared to shoot in high leverage moments. Like, we saw that at the end of his Philadelphia 76ers tenure, and that has always been the case since he's been with the Nets. If you're looking at as games progress, he'll come out and he'll do it in the first quarter. As games get into the second, third, and then into the fourth, into the clutch, into the high leverage moments when a guy like Cam Thomas is just dying to have the ball, Ben Simmons does not want anything to do with shooting the basket. And just numbers to like back that up. If you're looking at his field goal attempts by quarter, and I do this by per 36 minutes by quarter to, take out the differences in playing time. Ben, per 36 minutes, first quarter, 11.1 field goals. Second quarter, 4.3. Third quarter, 5.8. Fourth quarter, 2.4. So that's per 36 minutes. Like, that's all even baseline. First quarter, 11.1. Fourth quarter, 2.4. Ben, in 9 appearances this season, he's 0 of 2 shooting in the fourth quarter in 30 fourth quarter minutes. He's not made a field goal in the fourth quarter yet this season, which is just not good. He's not really a threat in any capacity in these moments. And I hate to be like negative, because he had a great first half, and I think he looked pretty good against Boston for long stretches. But the reason that I'm outlining this is, this is why I've said, since Ben Simmons joined the Nets, especially these last years when it became like really apparent that he cannot play a feature role. That meaning starting or closing games for an NBA team. Like, he cannot do that anymore. Can he still do things that impact the game in a niche reserve role? Yes, he can. He can pass, he can defend, he can rebound, he can do all those things. But if we're talking about Ben playing a feature role and having a future, and if you're trying to answer the question of like, does he have a future with the Nets in that capacity, which I think is already clear, but if you're trying to answer that question, I don't think he can. And I think that he can be a backup in a 5-out system and create for others and do all that. But that's what his future will be in the NBA, so long as he remains as passive as an offensive player. It's not going to be in a feature role. And in the Nets circumstance, that reserve role, that Jordy Fernandez is seemingly committing to him being in, because he recognizes all these things that I'm outlining. That's going to bring up some questions when Trendon Watford and Day'Ron Sharpe return to the lineup, which will be, Trendon, it seems like he suffered a setback with his hamstring, but it seems like it'll be soon. Him and Day'Ron, potentially by like the end of this month, maybe, is when their timelines, could be coming back. And Sharpe specifically, because we know Fernandez doesn't want to spend long stretches with 2 non-shooters sharing the floor. It just doesn't fit his offensive philosophy. So it's been easy to keep Ben in the lineup and play him all these minutes and do that when it's just Ben and Nick as like the center options. When you insert Day'Ron into that equation, something's got to give, and we'll see, how that starts to bear out. But that's kind of how I'm seeing a lot of what has happened with Ben Simmons earlier this season. And I think last night's performance was evident of the highs and then the lows, and how those things kind of bear out during a game script. Closing this out with some fan questions, going to try to rattle off through some of these quickly. Thank you to everybody who replied to my tweet, who sent me an email with questions. I try to get to as many of them as I can, but leading it off, if we keep winning, will the front office look to trade the veterans? Something I touched on earlier. I do think that they will. I think the question is when. How many of the veterans and when, I think, are the questions. But I do think if the Nets keep winning like this, and I do think regardless, I think it makes a lot of sense for some of these veterans to be on the move, and they would. Another trade-related question: should the cost Sean Marks had to pay Houston to reacquire our draft picks back have any effect on how we handle this season? We gave up a lot of valuable firsts for just a few of our own picks back. Interesting question, an interesting way of looking at it, because Sean, did pay a markup on that to Houston. He gave up, I think it was like 3 or 4 of the Phoenix picks to get his first round pick back this coming year, and then to negate a swap this coming year and then get his first back next year outright. Should that have an effect on how he's approaching it? I mean, like, yes or no, like indirectly. Like, I don't think that really has the effect. I think the bottom line is what sets this team up best moving forward for the future. And that is, I firmly believe in this class, acquiring a top draft pick and having the best odds possible, frankly, to land Cooper Flagg, who looks like the number one player in this draft class. So, whether you want to say it's because you paid a markup to get the picks back from Houston, like however you want to go about it, the Nets got those picks back and it was the right move. And I think the continued right move is to put yourself in a position to maximize that pick in a draft class that a lot of people are calling generational. So that's how I'm seeing that. Next one, should the Nets give Cam Thomas some minutes at point guard? That's the lone gripe I have so far with Jordy, and another example of how Ben is working against our goals this season. I think that's like an interesting conversation. I don't like Kevin Ollie played Cam at point guard in the second half of last season. I don't think Cam's a point guard. Like, I don't think there's any question that he's not like a primary floor general, traditional type guy in that role. But basketball is becoming more positionless. And I think guys who, have the ball a lot need to be able to run pick and roll, to, create for others, to do all of those things that you think like a traditional point guard should do. So, I think it's not really a question of should Cam be playing a point guard or how much, how many on ball, like pick and roll reps, doing those types of things that could lend himself and just give him more experience and reps as a ball handler, a transition ball handler, and making decisions along those lines. Because right now, particularly in transition, a lot of those opportunities are going to Ben Simmons. Like, Ben is the guy who's handling the ball in transition. He's making those decisions in the half court. I think Cam, when Ben's on the floor, I don't think he's taking too much away from what Cam is doing in terms of being able to handle the ball, like the number of reps he's getting, because in the half court, Ben's like really a center. Like, he plays with his back to the basket. He's a screener, not so much of a roller. So if you're looking at a way that Ben maybe is hurting Cam and you're looking at potential assists and things along those lines, like Cam and Nick Claxton, Cam comes off the pick and roll. He's had some really nice lobs to Nick this season. Cam pick and roll with Ben, it's a Ben pick. It's Cam go, and it's Ben no roll. The overwhelming majority of the time, he doesn't want to roll for easy, for reasons that I've already laid out here. So, I don't think they need to play him more at point guard, but I do think that there's a question of playing, Ben these large stretches of minutes, taking away from transition ball handling opportunities for Cam, and also not setting him up best in the pick and roll of having, a pick and roll man screener with him that he can really look to create with and look to find on some of these opportunities. I think a lot of these times it's putting him into situations where he's coming off the pick and roll. Guys are trailing his back hip. He has the big man and drop there, and Ben's not rolling. So he's kind of either has to try to get to the rim, take a mid-range, or look to like hit a wing guy off like the backside, help the shake man or whatever. So that's the ways that I think maybe Ben is impacting Cam. But I do think like the way that Jordy's been having Cam play this season, I really like it. The isolation attempts are way, 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 way down. A lot less isolation, a lot more pick and roll, which is the way that Jordy said he wanted Cam to play entering the year. And the next question is, what do you think of Cam Thomas's fit on this current roster? So this kind of all bears into that. Jordy said entering the year that he wanted Cam to be more efficient. He wanted him to take less dribbles. He wanted him to make quicker decisions. And I think that he's put him in a lot less isolation situations. And this team as a whole, it's a lot less isolation, a lot more pick and roll, a lot more. And in those pick and roll, it's also like Zoom, Chicago actions, like the pin downs into dribble handoffs that Cam's getting. So all of this, Jordy's trying to put Cam in positions where he's playing, he's creative, he's thinking inside the flow of the offense as opposed to isolation. And I think that all of that has really been beneficial for Cam in terms of him playing a style of basketball that can be, conducive to team basketball and success moving forward. So that's good stuff. And that's kind of how I see Cam's role on this team thus far this season. Next question, got a few more here. Where do you think the Knicks and the Bucks picks will land? Looking at the defensive struggle the Knicks are currently having, might be higher than expected. And I think this has been a topic of discussion for Nets fans. I think more about the Bucks thus far this season, because the Bucks have been the most disappointing team in the league, and the Nets own their first round pick via the Knicks and the Mikal Bridges trade. They own it top 4 protected. The Bucks are 2-8 to start the season, and they do not look like a team that is playing, anywhere near the level that people expected them or hoped that they would coming into this year. The Knicks are performing below expectations, not as bad as the Bucks. They're 4-5. The Bucks are 2-8. And I think that the Knicks aren't getting the production from Mikal Bridges that they were hoping for entering the year in terms of his defensive impact or, just the offensive role. He's been kind of relegated to a spot-up role there when you thought maybe he would do a little more given how much they gave up to get him. And he still may. The Nets have 2 matchups against the Knicks coming up, Friday and Sunday, both at MSG. So some interesting storylines there, and I'll cover all that. But I do think, it's tough to say right now, like where these picks are going to end up. If I try to put a range on it, the Bucks pick, I think, is the more interesting one, obviously. And, that has all like other types of implosion possibilities. Like if this starts to go really bad and Giannis acts out during the season, which I don't see happening, but it's definitely like, you can't say that that's completely out of the range of outcomes. And that really starts to get interesting in terms of how bad could this pick be. But assuming that he's there for the rest of the year, looking at kind of the range of how I see this, I mean, I do think that the Bucks are going to get better. Like they're going to gain a little bit more continuity. They're going to get Chris Middleton back. Their schedule is softening up a lot over the next 2-3 weeks. So I think they're going to get better. If we're trying to put like ranges on this, I think like the high range of that Bucks pick, assuming that Giannis is there the whole season, like I think that the late lottery would be like a possibility, and that would be just like an absolute home run for the Nets if that pick lands there. And I think like if we're looking at where it could get to if they start to play bad, like I think anywhere from the late lottery to like the mid-20s is the range of where that could land. And if I had to put a guess on it, I'd probably say somewhere in the middle, which would put it in like the high teens to low 20s, which in this draft class, that's a really good pick. And like that's a valuable pick. And that's a pick that the Knicks threw in there along with 4 other first-round picks and a first-round pick swap that could potentially be something, important for the Nets moving forward. It could be used to draft somebody in that spot. It could also be used with the other first-round picks they have to package and move up into maybe the back end of the lottery or something along those lines. So that's really valuable. Knicks also gave the Nets back their own second-round pick in this coming draft, which another reason, if you're looking to tank, not anywhere near as important, obviously, but you have your own pick, first rounder, which could be the best pick in the draft. And you have that second round pick, which could be close to like a late first rounder, depending on how bad you play yourself. So something that Nets fans shouldn't forget there. But, that's kind of the range of how I see that Bucks pick. The Knicks pick, I expect them to get a lot better. Like that pick should be in the mid-20s to low 20s if they start to get their stuff together. So that's how I'm seeing those. A couple more. If the Nets became buyers at this year's trade deadline, who would you want to trade for? Not something that I really see happening. I think the Nets will be much more sellers than buyers. If they are buying, I think that it's very clear what kind of player they should be targeting or what kind of player they will be targeting. And those are kind of like low risk, bounce back type players along the lines of what we saw with Zaire Williams, who they got from the Grizzlies this offseason. They took a flyer on him. They got him for nothing. If they're giving anything of value up, I would expect it to be not significant value. I would expect it to be for a player who had high pedigree coming in, who has performed below expectations, and maybe they think that they can get something out of. That is the only scenario that I really see them trying to make those kinds of moves. A guy that I threw around who I think could be interesting, talked about on my last podcast with Mike Scotto, Jarris Walker from the Indiana Pacers. Like that's an example of the type of guy. He was the number 8 pick in the draft a couple of years ago, hasn't been able to crack Indiana's rotation. They're trying to be competitive now. Could you potentially entice them with something to try to maybe pry him away from them? Is that realistic to get him specifically? I have no idea. Like, I don't know what their appetite is to trade him there in Indiana, but just using him as an example of the type of guys that I think that Sean Marks, if he were to trade for somebody, which I don't really see as likely at all right now, but that's the kind of move that I would expect him to make in that scenario. So that's about it. I gotta get out of here. A few more questions that I'm not able to get to, but I will be trying to take questions as often as I can. So if I did not get to yours now, next time I put out a feeler for questions, reply, and I'll make sure to try to get to it that time. But that does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. I'm Erik Slater. If you guys don't already, go to ClutchPoints.com. You can read all my articles. I'm getting up multiple per day there, news, updates, analysis, injuries, all that stuff you can find there. Go to my Twitter at Erik Slater _, tweeting every day, live tweeting all the games, highlights, interview clips, quotes, all that stuff you can find there. And most importantly, as I said at the top, if you don't already, subscribe to Believe in Nets wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Most importantly, go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA, where I'm posting these podcasts. I do some film breakdowns. I'm going to try to get some interview clips and other stuff up there. Go to there, subscribe. If you like this video, like it, comment it, leave any thoughts you have on my work or where the Nets are at. I'll take it into account. I'll try to address it on a future podcast. I really appreciate all that, but Nets are playing some good basketball right now. They came out of that 3-game road trip looking pretty decent. They have the Celtics at home on Wednesday. And then, as I said, they are the first installment of the Nets-Knicks rivalry post-Mikal Bridges trade, Friday and Sunday, both at MSG. I'll be at all those games. I'll have coverage of all of it everywhere I do my work, and most importantly, here on Believe in Nets. So keep following along, and I'll have more coverage as the season goes on. Talk to you guys soon.